Okay, welcome to this video about the civil rights movement in the USA. So in this video, we are going to be looking at the civil rights movement, which developed in the USA in the 20th century. In the years after the Second World War, the civil rights campaign has managed to achieve important change to bring about civil rights for black people in America. We're going to look at some examples of peaceful demonstrations, some examples of militant protest, some examples of politicians affecting change, and we're also going to talk about some key individuals of the civil rights movement as well. The main historical concepts that we're going to think about in this learning are the idea of Black Power, which is a movement to improve the rights of black people that emphasise direct action, racial pride and more militant action. Jim Crow laws were laws that segregated people in the southern states of the USA from the late 19th century until the mid-1960s. Non-violence is when people protest without using violence. Right is a legal entitlement to do something, such as vote, have free speech, assemble, go to school. And segregation is the act of keeping people or groups separate from each other. So after the American Civil War, which was 1861 to 1865, the American Constitution was amended, which means changed, to ban slavery and say all citizens of the USA should have equal rights. Now that led to a brief improvement in the rights of black people. But real changes are very slow to happen, especially in the South of America, in the southern states like Alabama, Mississippi, places like that. And states in the South, they brought in segregation. And now these racist laws, which are known as Jim Crow laws, meant there were separate facilities for black people and white people. This meant that in the 1950s, black and white children went to separate schools in the southern states. There were some facilities such as parks, swimming pools and restaurants which segregated, and black people and white people were even segregated when they were travelling on buses. So we're going to look at how the civil rights movement developed in the USA in the 1950s and 1960s. And we're going to look at the campaign to desegregate schools. We're going to look at the Montgomery Bus Boycott, the actions of Martin Luther King, and the Black Power movement. So we're going to talk about the campaign to desegregate schools. So after the Second World War, and this had happened in the years before, schools in the southern states of the USA were segregated. As you can see on this map, you can see those states in the south, like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, for example. They were segregated, which means there were separate schools for black children and white children. Now, in 1954, the highest court in America, the US Supreme Court, ruled 9-0 that schools should be desegregated, which means that there should no longer be separate facilities for black children and white children, in a ruling which is known as the Brown versus Board of Education Topeka ruling. Now, the case involved a girl called Linda Brown. Now, her father, who was called Oliver Brown, brought a legal case because his daughter was not allowed to go to her local school in Topeka in Kansas because that was a school for white children. But despite the Brown verdict, schools did not desegregate straight away. Now, we're going to find out a story about the events at Little Rock High School in September 1957. Now, Little Rock High School was in Little Rock in Arkansas. Now, after the Brown verdict, Brown versus Board of Education verdict, many schools had begun to slowly desegregate. And in September 1957, 9 black students prepared to start the school year at Little Rock High School in Arkansas, which had been an all-white school. Now, on the first day of term, the governor of Arkansas, who was called Orville Forbes, sent 250 state troops to stop the black students going in. 8 of the 9 students did not try to go to school on that day, but one did, and she was called Elizabeth Eckford, who you can see pictured in the front of this picture carrying her school folder. Elizabeth Eckford tried to enter the school against a mob of white people protesting and was unable to enter. Now, the famous photograph you can see of her was seen around the USA and the entire world, and the reactions of the white mob outside the school towards this schoolgirl shocked the world. Eventually, President Eisenhower, who was the American president at the time, ordered federal troops to Little Rock to ensure that the black children could attend school. Now, another really important event that happened in 1955 was an event called the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which many of you have probably heard of because it's one of the most famous events in the civil rights movement. Now, bus travel was segregated in Montgomery, Alabama. White and black people had to sit in separate parts of the buses, and if the buses were crowded, a black person had to give up their seat so a white person did not have to stand. Now, in December 1955, this woman who you can see pictured here, called Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat to a white man. She was thrown off the bus and arrested, and this sparked off an event known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Now, Rosa Parks' actions began one of the most famous protests of the civil rights movement. Now, at the time in Montgomery in Alabama, a young Baptist minister called Martin Luther King was organising a boycott of the bus company in response to what had happened. Black people refused to use the company's buses and walked instead. And it's an example of a non-violent protest. The USA and the world followed the boycott on television, radio and in the newspapers. And after 381 days, the bus company gave in and the US Supreme Court declared that segregation on the buses should not be allowed. It was a huge victory for the civil rights movement and led to more peaceful protests across the USA. Now, another famous example of non-violent protest was the sit-ins. The Montgomery Bus Boycott led to more non-violent protests in the civil rights movement. In February 1960, 4 African-American students sat down at an all-white lunch counter in the Woolworth department store in Greensboro in North Carolina. They asked to be served but were refused, so they staged a sit-in where they simply refused to leave. This action was copied by other students and eventually it spread across the southern states and included art galleries, beaches, parks and swimming pools. Within 18 months, 70,000 people had taken part in sit-ins and 3,000 had been arrested. This led to media coverage and put pressure on politicians to bring about change. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King had emerged as the leader of the civil rights movement. Now, there were lots of civil rights groups at this time, but Martin Luther King became almost like the figurehead, the leader of the non-violent civil rights movement in America at the time. Now, in August 1963, Martin Luther King made one of the most famous speeches in history. And it was called the I Have a Dream speech. It was after a march on Washington involving 250,000 people, including 40,000 white people. The speech was delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, and the speech had a huge impact and helped put pressure on politicians to pass new laws. President John F. Kennedy was a supporter of civil rights and was inspired by the speech. So let's hear an extract of that speech now.
We face the difficulties of today and tomorrow. I still have a dream. Yeah. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
So King's speech was obviously very, very inspiring, and it helping about pressure for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to be passed. Now, by this stage, there was a new president in America called President Lyndon Johnson, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. Now, pressure from the Civil Rights Movement had prompted the government in the USA to make new laws to improve the rights of black people. Civil Rights Act said that it banned discrimination in public places, it banned job discrimination, gave the government the power to force schools to desegregate, and it gave the government the power to remove funding if a state in the USA discriminated. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ensured that all people were able to register to vote, and the government would run voter registration programs to ensure everyone could register to vote. Now, another important civil rights leader was Malcolm X. Now, he was born Malcolm Little but changed his name to Malcolm X to reflect the fact that his surname of Little was actually a slave surname. Malcolm X rejected non-violence. He said non-violent action was not working to improve the lives of black people. He said the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act did not really help black people with problems like racism, discrimination and poverty. Just before he died, though, he was beginning to want to work with other civil rights groups, including Martin Luther King, but Malcolm was assassinated in February 1965. After his death, many people focused on his early beliefs and his criticisms of non-violence, and he very much inspired a new movement which was known as the Black Power movement, where many black people rejected non-violence and focused on this idea. Now, you can see here a picture of Malcolm X pictured with Martin Luther King in 1964, the only time they met, which was entirely by chance, in Washington. Towards the end of his life, Malcolm had come round to using more non-violent ideas, but in his early life he had spoken out against non-violence. Now, the Black Power movement became quite popular from the mid-1960s. The Black Power movement encouraged black people to be proud of their culture and heritage, reject help from white people and rely on themselves, and argued that forced integration would not bring equality. Black Power had most support among the poor, especially in the north actually of America as well, who often had low-paid jobs and poor housing. Now, a civil rights leader who became a key advocate for Black Power was Stokely Carmichael, who you can see pictured here. His approach on the idea of black nationalism, racial pride and self-defense was an important development in the civil rights campaign. It also reflected that many black people did not feel they had gained full rights from the non-violent campaigns and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Now, another famous Black Power movement was the Black Panthers. They were set up in California in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. They attracted media attention when they went into the state capital of California, Sacramento, armed with guns to protest. The Black Panthers saw themselves as police and social workers within black communities, and they did the following things. They patrolled the streets in black communities to keep them safe. They worked to create rainbow coalitions to encourage cooperation between different non-white city gangs. They ran courses on black history and civil rights. They carried guns for self-defense and tape recorders to record police harassment, and they ran breakfast clubs for poor black children. And you can see there a picture of a Black Panthers breakfast club. So, reflecting on the civil rights movement today, racism in the world has unfortunately not gone away. The lessons of the civil rights movement tell us that protest against any form of discrimination, including racism, is really important. It's important that everyone stands up against any form of discrimination today. So try and reflect on what lessons you can take from the inspiring stories of the civil rights movement in the USA. And you can see here images of the civil rights movement against protests against racism in the world today. As we've seen, the fight against racism and discrimination continues. So here's some examples of what we've learned about in that presentation, about examples of the peaceful demonstrations, but also more militant protest. We found out about different politicians that were involved in the civil rights movement during this time, and we found out some examples of some key individuals as well. So thanks very much for listening to that presentation about the civil rights movement in the USA. Thanks very much. Goodbye.